So here we are back in service info, and we're looking at the modes of operation for the PCM, the powertrain control module. And we're just going to run through the service info real quick, same way we have been doing. So as input signals to the PCM change, the PCM adjusts its response to the output devices. So this is where, when I talk about service information, this is where I talk about cutting all the BS, the useless information, the stuff we already know. Yeah, we have a module. It gets input signals, and it adjusts its response to output signals. Not really, anything groundbreaking or super useful or anything else, so we just blow through that. They give us an example of injector pulse width and ignition timing for idle versus wide open throttle. We don't care. We already know a PCM operates in open and closed loop. Blow it through, don't care. During open loop and closed loop, for our purposes, for a no crank, we don't care about any of this stuff. Fuel injection system has the following modes of operation: ignition switch on, engine startup crank, engine warm up, idle, cruise, acceleration, deceleration, wide open throttle, ignition switch off. The ignition switch on, ignition switch startup, cranking position, which is what we don't have, is crank. Engine warm up, acceleration, deceleration, and wide open throttle are all open loop. Idle and cruise modes with engine at operating temp are closed loop modes. So, out of all of this, we know that the fuel injection system uses different strategies based off of what particular mode of operation we're in. Not really giving us a whole lot of information here. Now, we did talk about that starter relay or starter solenoid high side driver data pin in the PCM, and we want to know a little more about that. What is the PCM looking at to get to that? And that's why we're going through this theory of operation here. We know we don't have it. We know the PCM first has to command the high side of the starter relay on, and then at the same time send a message over the bus to the BCM to command the low side of the starter relay coil. That will control the starter relay, allow it to switch over, and allow the engine to crank over. So once again, we've got some direct inputs, we've got some indirect inputs, and that's what we're trying to go through here and see if we can find some better information. So let's go here. And modes of operation, ignition switch, key on mode. So open loop mode, PCM determines atmospheric pressure, don't care. PCM monitors ECT, don't care. Intake manifold air temperature, not really caring about that. TPS, we're not super concerned with. ASD, once again, that's not going to give us our no crank in this particular situation. Fuel pump, it's not like it's a crank no start, it's just a no crank, so we can blow through that. As soon as I see O2 sensor for a no crank, I'm not super concerned about that. At this point. What I am concerned with is engine startup mode. Is there going to be any information within this section that's going to be useful for me for determining where the next place I want to go is? Now, keep in mind, this PCM has been tuned. It had a Whipple supercharger on it. It had nitrous on it. Remember, the customer had the engine torn down, different rings, different pistons in it, pulled the Whipple off of it, went to a ProCharger setup. There's PCM tuning involved in that. Is there a possibility, seeing as I can't update the PCM software to the most recent to eliminate or confirm a software issue, I'm stuck with trying to diagnose around the software at this point. And so, is there a possibility, while we were modifying all these parameters on the late model vehicle to accommodate our different air intake or differing fuel strategy and everything else, that we could have inadvertently had the tuner go through and modify something that is now not agreeing or logic locking and disabling starter relay control? That's what we care about. That's what we're trying to prove out. And that's kind of why a lot of people don't want to deal with these tuned, modified vehicles, is a lot of times it does come down to a bad tune. And how do you prove or disprove software? Coming from my history and being a dealer tech for John Deere, I came up with a couple ways, and that's why I harp so heavy on critical analysis and interpretation of service information, because that's actually how I was able to multiple times prove or disprove an inherent programming issue within the software, be it bad code, be it bad interactions, whatever it may be. So, long story long, let's get back to the important stuff that we care about. So, engine startup mode, open loop. Following actions occur when the starter motor is engaged. So right off the bat, I'm not feeling super confident that this is going to give me anything strictly from their wording. So their wording is when the starter motor is engaged. So we do know when we press the button that it goes through a crank cycle. The dashboard dims and a few other things occur like we would expect during a regular starter engagement and cranking. So we don't want to fully write it off, but just based off of the wording and knowing the fact that the PCM monitors the starter relay high side driver, we can kind of feel pretty confident that what we're going to see here isn't going to be useful, but let's go through. It receives inputs from direct battery voltage. We know that's good. Pedal value sensors, brake pedal and accelerator pedal. Both of those are good. ECT at ambient temperature. Crank sensor. We don't really care about the crank sensor because it's not cranking. Intake manifold air temperature. Once again, it's a temperature sensor. Pass the plausibility checks as we talked about before. Same with the map sensor. TPS, that was good, although that would be something you may want to be concerned about, especially with a modified tune. If somebody was trying to shortcut it, they may very well play with the values of the TPS without properly understanding what that entails. But I have yet to run into a vehicle where a differing or wide open throttle position sensor value creates a no crank. It may be a no start, it may go into a clear flood mode, but I've never seen it cause a no crank yet. Doesn't mean it can't, just have not seen it yet. Camshaft position sensor, once again, not going to cause a no crank. Got to be cranking over to be able to read a value off of it. So let's bounce over to our last little bit here. And PCM monitors the crank sensor. If the PCM does not receive a crank position sensor signal within approximately 3 seconds of cranking the engine, it will shut down the fuel injector system. Once again, we have no crank. So obviously, it's going to shut down the fuel injection system to prevent cylinder wash after 3 seconds of cranking because we're not cranking. Fuel pump is activated by the PCM. We don't care. We're not cranking. Voltage is applied to the fuel injectors. Once again, we're not even at that point. We have a no crank. We don't care about fueling, spark timing, any of that right now. We care about starter engagement, specifically starter relay coil control, which will then lead to starter engagement. So we don't have a lot of really great information here, do we? So where do we go from here? All right, now that we've delved into the BCM a little bit, we're going to switch over to our PCM, our powertrain control module. So we're going to kick right into our engine here, and we're going to take a look at data PIDs there. So typical, click data. In this case, let's start with ignition. And we'll see what we got going on here. So we have our target idle speed. NGC, you know what we're going to switch this up a little bit. We're going to go to a custom data list, which is more accurate to the way I normally diagnose things. So it's going to go through and it's going to give us the ability to choose on Chrysler's everything we care about. So right now, we've got like our O2 sensor section here.
A lot of that I really don't care about at this point, to be completely honest, because I have a no crank. Now, one thing I do see at the bottom here is NGC, New Generation Controller, which is the Chrysler PCM for this particular vehicle, should shut off fuel. I do care about that because I'm going to want to know if it does say we should shut off fuel, I'm going to want to know why, and that'll give me a direction there. So we do have one good data pin, not something I would expect to see under O2 sensors, but, you know, these things happen. ASD relay, I'm not super concerned about this at this point because I have dash illumination. I've got a few other things. EVAP EGR, we're going through. I'm not seeing a whole lot of stuff I'm concerned about there. You know, fuel pump relay desired state, we'll go with that. That may be useful. Ignition. Multi-displacement, we're not concerned about that. Ignition off run start switch, we are concerned about. Crank system fault and in limp home mode, we're concerned about. Ignition run start switch. So we have our off run start switch and our ignition run start switch, a regular ignition start switch. Skim VTA as completed. We care about that. Security fault. Although we did touch on that briefly, possibly. I'm kind of feeling this a little bit out of order here, but keep in mind that Skim VTA, that's our anti-theft, vehicle theft, and our Century Key immobilizer system. If we had a fault within that, our center button of our ignition switch would be blinking. If we had some kind of fault, disagreement in ignition switch status, loss of key fob communication, something along those lines, we would likely, supposedly, and software does have issues at times, but it should throw a trouble code as well as blink the center button of the ignition switch to allow us to know that that's where the fault lies. Skim VTA invalid key received, fault posted. We'll put that on there. Let's take a look at accessories. And you'll see some of these data PIDs here are, in fact, in multiple data PID groupings. So we got that. Brake switch 2, filtered state. Yeah, let's throw the brake switch in there. We want to make sure that the PCM is seeing the brake switch. It is not a direct input to the PCM. Once again, our direct versus indirect inputs and outputs. But it is communicated over the bus. Keep in mind we have a modified and tuned PCM, so there is always the potential when you're tuning or modifying factory software that you could have other unintended glitches, so we do want to make sure everybody's getting the right messages at the right time. And we'll go through here, we're going through some other data PIDs, and I'm not seeing a whole lot else I'm really super concerned about at this point. And so we're going to go to our graph view. We're going to take a look. So we see right off the bat our Skim VTA invalid key received, fault posted is false. Skim VTA is completed. That means the handshake between the RF hub, the BCM, and the key fob have all gone through, at least to this point, as expected, which is awesome. So once again, steering us away from an anti-theft fault. Also keep in mind, if we jump out that starter relay, pins 30 and pins 87, so send constant power direct to the load. While somebody's pushing the push button ignition, this car will crank over and it'll run under its own power and not stall. If we had an anti-theft fault, this car would run for approximately 2 to 3 seconds and shut off by killing fuel injection or ignition spark. Ignition start switch in this point is in the off position because we're not commanding a crank or a start position. Ignition run, which we are currently in, is showing as on, so that's good. Ignition off, run start switch is in off. We currently don't have a crank system fault. We're not in limp home mode. Fuel pump relay desired state is false because we're not cranking, nor did we just cycle the ignition on. Brake switch filtered switch state is off, and then on when I press the brake. So we know, once again, yet another module that needs to see a brake input is seeing what it wants to see. And we also see our NGC should shut off fuel is false, meaning currently that our new generation controller, our PCM, sees no reason why it should pull fueling away from the engine. So that once again leads us back to, we've got a lot of things going right, so we can start checking off that list that we've been developing through service information as to things that we no longer care about, to help us go down the funnel and narrow in on the components that are actually causing this lack of starter relay coil control. And I'm just going to go depress the brake pedal and hit our start. And we see our ignition start goes to the on position. NGC does not decide to shut off fuel. We don't have a crank system fault. We're in limp home mode. So we're looking pretty good within that PCM. We're feeling pretty confident about that. So what's our next step? And we're going to hop back into service information and our theory of operation to determine where our next step would be.